Well, hi, everybody. Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be joining us from in the world. Welcome to the MRCT Center's second webinar in our Health Literacy Month webinar series entitled Creating and Sharing Plain Language Summaries, One Team's Experience. Health Literacy Month was actually founded 25 years ago by someone who's become a dear friend and mentor of mine, Helen Osborne, and it's now coordinated by the Institute for Healthcare Advancement. And it's an opportunity for us to recognize where we have made progress in the area of making health, medicine, and research more understandable, and also take stock of where we can go to improve and continue growing as a field and as professionals together. Um, I would love to move forward with our rest of our agenda today. So I'll have next slide, please. Sorry, I'm getting used to not controlling my own slides, so apologize for that. Thanks, and thank you for joining today. Our tips for actually being part of the webinar are really to use the Q&A for your questions. Put those in the Q&A function in the bottom of your Zoom toolbar, and then we'll do our best to answer live. We also invite you to use the closed captioning that's available on the Zoom toolbar as well, if that makes it easier for you to understand what is being said during the webinar. And also, please note that most of the links that we will be discussing, any of the things that we're referring to in our presentations, will also be shared in the chat by my colleague, Kaylee. So you'll be able to click on the links there and then copy them from your browser. But rest assured, no matter what, the recording slides and all the additional materials will be available next week as well for you to be able to peruse and share with your colleagues. Next slide, please. So before I get started, I'll just note that all of these opinions, all of the material here are the opinions of the speakers and not intended to represent the position of Brigham and Women's Hospital, Harvard University, or any other entity. The MRCT Center is funded by a variety of different external sources. And regardless of who funds us, however, we are committed to the autonomy in our research and transparency in all of our relationships. And so in the end, all of our materials, products, results, and deliverables remain under the control of the MRCT Center and its leadership. Next slide, please. So hopefully you're sufficiently welcomed, and we'll have a little bit of some intros, and then we'll move into a quick overview presentation that I'll do on health literacy and return of results at the MRCT Center. And then I'll be able to pass the baton on to this wonderful team from the Dana Farber Harvard Cancer Center's Breast Oncology Research Advocacy Program and their science writer talking about their plain language summary process. We'll have a moderated discussion and Q&A, and then a wrap up and thank you with a few announcements at the end. Next slide, please. So these are our esteemed, venerable speakers. We have Timothy Erick, who's a science writer at the Dana Farber Cancer Institute. Christine McLaughlin, who's a patient research advocate within the Breast Cancer Research Advocacy Group at Dana Farber, and Paula Steeves, a co-lead advocate in the Breast Cancer Research Advocacy Group, also at Dana Farber. And I'm Sylvia Baedorf Kassis, in case you don't know me already. I'm the program director at the Multi-Regional Clinical Trials Center of Brigham and Women's Hospital at Harvard, the MRCT Center, and I've had the privilege of leading our health literacy related initiatives over the last 6.5 years. Next slide, please. So the MRCT Center itself has been around for 15 years. It's actually our 15th anniversary this year. And it's a research and policy center based out of Boston and Cambridge, Massachusetts, that's focused on addressing the conduct, oversight, ethics, and the regulatory environment of clinical trials. And so over the last 15 years and looking ahead to the future, our vision is to always improve the integrity, safety, and rigor of global clinical trials. And we do that by identifying the opportunities that are existing for improvement, developing standards around those, establishing best practices for clinical research, conduct, oversight, and ethical behavior, and improving transparency overall of the clinical trial ecosystem, which is a huge theme of today's session. Our mission and the way that we do our work is to engage many different types of people from across the ecosystem to define what those emerging issues are and even continued issues, because we know, like many things, plain language summaries and return of results is an ongoing activity and goal that we're striving towards. But we really work towards creating and implementing ethical, actionable, and always practical solutions, really striving for people to be able to do what they need to do in their roles day to day in order to take our principles and put them into action. Next slide, please. So when I came on board in 2018, it was January 2018, and we had just released, the MRCT Center, before I arrived, had just released a guidance and toolkit on the return of aggregate results to participants. This was inspired largely by the EU's mandate that the announcement started in 2013, and the implementation just went into effect in 2022. So a long process. Again, we're going to be talking today about how things take time. Things take time to take action. But this guidance and toolkit that the MRCT Center created was born out of this EU mandate that results must be returned to participants in clinical trials in the EU, and that it would be done by a portal in the EU. And sponsors around the world, and particularly in the EU who had research studies in the EU, were concerned about how they were going to do this. How were they going to communicate in plain language around the results of complex clinical trials and make those available to participants? So the MRCT Center worked with a large work group of representatives from across the industry to develop guidance and toolkit for that. At the same time, in 2017, the MRCT Center authored a draft FDA guidance, basically following suit of what the EU was doing to say, hey, FDA, you could also be putting something like this into effect, and here is some draft language to help you along. While this has not been adopted by the FDA to date, it exists in the public record as the MRCT Center's support of and desire for such a mandate to come down from regulators like the FDA to ensure that results will be shared with patients and participants moving forward. And so this is something that is there, and we continue to look towards to push this mission forward. Next slide, please. When I came on board, having just seen the launch of the guidance and toolkit on return of results, there was a real need around health literacy in clinical research at that time. We were talking a lot about, well, here we are talking about plain language, numeracy, making information understandable to participants at the end of the study. But it was missing, of course, that if we started these clear communications from the beginning, that would actually very much help with return of results, because you'd have this continuum of consistent plain language information that's being passed from beginning of the study to the end of the study, but also just to ensure that we were really having a conversation around health literacy writ large in the clinical research ecosystem. And there was no such resource that existed at that point. So we developed with a work group of individuals an entire resource devoted to health literacy across the clinical research life cycle. And one of the things that we talked about, of course, is end of study, return of results, sort of looping back to the toolkit that we'd already released in 2017, but now creating and updating our plain language summary template to be a downloadable, fillable Word document. And it's available at this URL here. And I know Kaylee is putting all these URLs in the chat for you. So we've been trying to continue the conversation on returning results, making tools available where we can. And this came out in 2019. Next slide, please. What I will say is in the intervening years, we've continued to have conversations with mostly now academics, because industry, because of the EU mandate, is starting to return their results. It isn't necessarily always consistently done in places that are not having sites in the EU, but there is definitely more of a process in place within industry to bring results back to participants who are in studies. this has not taken hold in the US in the same way. And been meeting regularly over the last couple of years with academics around the country, IRBs, institutional review boards, and ethics committees to kind of figure out, like, how can we make this stick? And it's still a work in progress. But what I will say is that the MRCT Center remains committed to this mission of making sure that results are getting into the hands of participants. And over the summer, there came out a request for information from the National Library of Medicine around evolving the network of the National Library of Medicine. And this request for information was really talking about how could the network of the National Library of Medicine improve, evolve, expand. Since the clinicaltrials.gov, a place that is a site for registering studies, falls under the leadership of NLM and is overseen by the National Library of Medicine, we felt it was important to include in our response a recommendation that clinicaltrials.gov be expanded to include an element for the sharing of plain language aggregate results to past study participants. The emphasis being on plain language. We know that results are being input, data is being input into the clinicaltrials.gov interface for studies that complete, but we're talking about making sure that plain language summaries have a place on clinicaltrials.gov as well. And this is an area where we'll continue to advocate. And I understand that there are still some critiques or concerns around clinicaltrials.gov overall as being the clearinghouse for research recruitment and results reporting, but it is the source that we have right now. And we want to leverage the sources that are existing in order to make sure that results can get into the hands of participants. And so with that, what I'll do is pass the baton on to Paula Steeves. Next slide, please. Who's actually going to share an experience that Dana Farber Cancer Institute has had in terms of getting results into the hands of participants. But before they could get it into the hands of participants, they had to create them, create a process, figure out how they were going to do it. And Paula and her team has been so kind to join us today to share her experience and their experience of doing this. Thank you so much, Paula, for being here today.
Thank you, Sylvia. And thank you to the MRCT and Sylvia for inviting us for this presentation. Next slide, please. So today I'm going to share our team's experience at Dana Farber on creating and sharing plain language summaries. And this is Tim Erick, Christine McLaughlin, and myself. Next slide, please. So the agenda for today is I'm going to give a brief overview of Dana Farber's Breast Oncology Center. I'm going to talk about our PLS's program's purpose, give you an overview, and then I'm going to go through the 3 phases. Phase 1, the PLS creation process. Phase 2, getting the PLSs on the Dana Farber website. And 3, getting PLSs in the hands of the trial participants. Next slide, please. So a little bit about Dana Farber Breast Oncology Center. There's about 30 plus medical oncologists. We have a cross-functional staff resources. We have a large active patient research advocate group, which I co-lead and Christine is a part of. And we have many clinical trials. And this picture is a picture of the Breast Oncology Center leadership. Next slide, please. So our PLS program's purpose is twofold. First, we wanted to be able to effectively communicate aggregate clinical trial results to a specific audience. Of course, the trial participants, patients, family members and caregivers, and interested members of the public. And we also wanted to develop a program to create and share these PLSs that was consistent, efficient, timely, and scalable. And what has been really important for us is that we have full support by Dana Farber's breast oncology leadership. Next slide, please. So this is an overwhelming program. And so what we decided to do is we decided to break it up into 3 phases. So our first phase is the PLS creation process, which we have completed, and I'll share with you. The second phase is getting the PLSs on our Dana Farber website. That's done, and I'll share that with you. And the third phase is getting the PLS in the hands of the trial participants, which is in progress, and I'll share where we are with that. Next slide, please. So first, our PLS creation process. Next slide. So the scope of our process was Dana Farber investigator-led interventional clinical trials. Dana Farber investigator-led non-interventional studies, and to produce the PLS as soon as possible based on the published manuscripts. Next slide, please. So we formed a cross-functional team. Of course, the principal investigator or investigators, the Breast Oncology Center science writer, Tim, who's here today, the breast patient research advocates, which includes myself and Christine. We had a breast oncology graphic designer, Heidi. And because we were posting them on the Dana Farber website, we had our communications department involved. Next slide, please. And we did our own benchmarking. We read the EU regulation and the Good Lay summary practice. We spoke with third-party medical communications agencies. Of course, we used the MRCT guidance, and we looked at industry plain language summaries. Next slide, please. So then we determined, what did we want our PLS to look like? What sections did we want to include in our PLS? And we wanted to make the PLS no more than 4 pages. So why was the trial done? Who took part? What treatments did they receive? What were the results? What were the side effects? How is the trial helped? And where can I learn more about this trial? Next slide, please. So our PLS content, keeping in mind who our audience is, trial participants, patients, and such. So the PLS is based on, of course, the published results that I mentioned. And then we determined what content from the published paper we wanted to include and not include in the PLS. We had the patient perspective provided by the research advocates. We had careful attention to quality control. And of course, we had the PI initiation and sign-off. Next slide, please. So next, we determined what our style guide was. And there's 4 key points to this. So I had mentioned earlier, we wanted it short in length, no more than 4 pages. We wanted lay language. So define medical and scientific words if terminology must be used. So for example, chemotherapy. We wanted to keep words simple. So for example, instead of saying substantially, we said a lot. And then we wanted to avoid acronyms and slang. As an example, site, S-I-T-E, can mean website, not necessarily location. The next thing is paragraphs and sentences. So we wanted to try and keep short paragraphs, short sentences, no run-on sentences. But we also had to consider sentence order within a paragraph. And lastly, simple graphics. Use tables for side effects, given a participant may have more than one side effect. We felt pie charts are more easily understood. We wanted to avoid complex bar charts and graphics. And we wanted to make sure color was consistent with ADA compliance and printability. Next slide, please. So we came up with our PLS process workflow. So our science writer, Tim, summarized the trial results in lay language and created the first draft of the PLS. And then he would share that with the patient advocates, and we would provide feedback to him on the content and the wording. And then Tim and the patient advocates would meet to discuss. Sometimes one meeting was necessary, and sometimes multiple meetings was necessary, given the complexity of these trials. And then, once we were all in agreement, then the PI would verify that the PLS is aligned with the published trial results. And then our graphic designer, Heidi, created visuals to support the text. And then, because, as I said earlier, we were posting them on the Dana Farber website, our communications department had to provide final copy editing. Next slide, please. So please don't get overwhelmed by this workflow chart, but it's really here to show you that we have the multiple swim lanes with the science writer, Tim, the patient advocates, the PI, the graphic designer, administration, communication. And it's really to show that it's an iterative process. So once we get the trial results from the PI and Tim gets those, he reviews them, he writes the first draft, and then he sends to us, the patient advocates. And then we review the published paper and the draft, and we provide him feedback. And I know I'm only showing one loop here, but sometimes that loop is multiple until he creates the next draft that would go to the PI. And then once the PI is okay, then it goes to our graphic designer. And there could be multiple iterations of that, especially when we first started, because we had to finally agree on what we really wanted to use as a template. So, and then of course, it gets signed off by the PI. Next slide, please. So now we want to show you our example of a PLS. Next slide, please. So this is the first 2 pages. And what I'm going to do in future slides is I'm actually going to go through each section, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. Can you go to the next slide, please? And here are the next 2 pages. Next slide, please. So now what I'll do is I'm going to go through each of the sections of the PLS. Next slide, please. So we call this our opening section. And here we provide an overview of the trial's purpose. We express gratitude to the trial participants. And we let the reader know that we're sharing aggregate results, not individual results. Next slide, please. In this section, why was the trial done? Here we frame the issue, we give background and the status of the disease, we explain why this research matters, and we explain what the researchers are studying. Next slide, please. In this section, who took part? We decided that we wanted to share sample size and gender in the PLS, the age range of the participants, the disease subtype and stage, and then trial enrollment timeframe. Now in this section, to support the text, we had Heidi add a visual for us. So you can see in this one, there was 125 people enrolled, and they range from the age of 21 to 65 years old. Next slide, please. In this section, what treatments did they receive? We outline the medications, how the medications were given, and what the medication schedule was. And again, here you can see we've added a visual component of the infusion schedule to support the text. Next slide, please. In this section, what were the results? Here we talk about the primary endpoint, the secondary endpoint, and other results important to patients. And we also provide a plain language explanation of statistical significance. Next slide, please. So this section is what were the side effects. So here we include at least the most common side effects outlined in the published paper. We can show more, but we want to show at least what the most common ones were. And then we define non-familiar medical terms. As an example, in this one, it's neutropenia. Next slide, please. How has the trial helped? So in this section, we talk about how did it move cancer research forward? How did it impact care outcomes for patients? We reference important correlative data if appropriate, and we reference any future trials based on these results. Next slide, please. In this section, we tell the reader where they can learn more about the trial. So we reference the published papers, and we also reference clinicaltrials.gov's website. Next slide, please. And in the closing section, we direct the trial participants on whom to speak to if they have any questions. And then we also have Dana Farber specific language in here, and we add the Dana Farber copyright. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to show you a second example. And I think the key thing in this second example is the fact that every trial is different, and we have to have flexibility in our process. So if you can go to the next slide. This one looks pretty similar to the first one I showed you. The only difference in this one is there were men and women in this trial. So in the graphic, you can see 1 man and 97 women. Next slide, please. And here's pages 3 and 4. Next slide, please. But what I want to point out to you is we added 2 new sections to this plain language summary. The first, what were the research goals? And we explain the primary objective of the trial and how success would be measured. Next slide, please. And then in this section, what did participants and medical providers think about a meaning chemotherapy after surgery? Here, we share survey results. This was in the published paper. It wasn't a primary or secondary endpoint, but we as patients felt it was really important to include in the paper, so we added this new section. So having some flexibility is really important. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to talk about our phase 2, the PLSs on the Dana Farber website. Next slide, please. So the scope for this phase of the project was that we wanted to put them on Dana Farber's breast cancer clinical trials and research homepage. We wanted the ability to search for them in Dana Farber's search function. And then we wanted to organize the PLSs by subtype, stage, and manuscript publication date. Next slide, please. So here is a screenshot of the home page for the breast cancer research plain language summaries. Next slide, please. And here's a screenshot of how we broke it up into the 3 subtypes: ER positive, HER2 positive, and triple negative breast cancer. And then by stage, early stage and advanced stage metastatic. Next slide, please. So now let's talk about our phase 3, getting the PLS in the hands of the trial participants. Next slide, please. So for us, the scope of this was we wanted to be able to use existing Dana Farber workflows, tools, and technology. We wanted to be able to electronically distribute the PLS to living clinical trial participants. We wanted to be able to customize the communication, including opt-in and opt-out feature. We wanted to have reporting metrics and capability. We wanted to be able to use automation where we could. And we wanted to have an efficient and scalable process. Next slide, please. So where are we? So we just started 2 weeks ago the workflow, tools, and technology assessment. So we have a long way to go. But one thing I wanted to say, and we wanted to say, is, this a one-off, a manual process is inefficient, time-consuming, and not scalable. So going through this process and being patient and getting it done is really important to us, and that's what we're striving for. Next slide, please. So now we want to share with you some of our lessons learned in our process. Again, this is our process. This is the audiences, the patients, the trial participants, etc. Next slide, please. So audience diversity. The target audience can vary widely, each with different levels of understanding, and sometimes even more important, their interest in medical topics. There's ethical considerations. It's crucial to ensure that the PLS is accurate and not misleading, as it can impact patients' understanding of potential risks and benefits. You have to consider emotional sensitivity and respectful tone. Addressing these sensitive topics related to health outcomes, side effects, or participant experiences require careful wording to avoid causing stress. And you want to be able to engage the audience and the reader, and making these PLS engaging and relevant while maintaining accuracy can be a tricky balance, especially if you want to keep it to 4 pages. Next slide, please. So for us, with breast cancer trials, there's pretty complicated terminology, and it involves technical medical language that needs to be simplified without losing essential meaning. And summarizing complex data, distilling this data into understandable language without oversimplifying or misrepresenting findings can be difficult. Shorter, I can tell you, shorter can be much harder. And balancing detail and clarity. It's important to provide enough detail to summarize the trial's results and significance, while remaining clear and concise. So striking this balance can be tough. And feedback from lay people. So for us, incorporating feedback from few lay people ensured understanding by persons with limited medical or scientific knowledge. For us, multiple perspectives absolutely gave us a better outcome. Next slide, please. So team composition and workflow. It needs to be tailored to your situation for all phases, especially the 3rd phase of getting the PLS in the hands of trial participants. Organizational support. Building this support, it's important and it's time consuming. But if you start early, you're better off. And then continuous learning. We can say that every PLS we created offered an opportunity to learn, to improve, to reflect on what worked and what didn't work. And it absolutely built our skills and improved the content quality over time. Next slide, please. So we just thought, if you haven't started yet, how do you get started? So we thought we would just kind of put a few things in place here to show you. Next slide, please. So identify the members of your PLS team and define their roles. Define your intended audience and keep in mind when writing the PLSs. Have the PLS reviewed by people who represent the intended audience. Determine which trials and studies for which you want to create a PLS. Define your PLS section outline and style guide. Determine what content you want to include in each section. And define guidance for what to include and not to include from the published paper in your PLS. And create a process workflow that works for you and your institution. Next slide, please. So we really want to thank Dana Farber for all the support, because without them, we wouldn't be where we are today. We have a long way to go in phase 3, and we have the support to do that. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Paula, for that thorough overview of how you and your team, the team, has approached creating PLS for patients in the breast oncology program, participants there in those studies. I'd love to invite Tim to come on camera as well. So we've got Timothy Erick, again, Christine McLaughlin, and Paula Steeves, all here to also answer some questions. I'm going to let Paula take a little breather for a second since she just did that presentation. She's going to look at the questions that are in the that have come in the Q&A. There's a whole bunch that came in there, Paula, so you kind of can take a look at those. And in the meantime, I'm going to invite Tim to kind of talk a little bit about his experience because Tim's a science writer. Tim's a science writer with a PhD in science matters. So how did you learn to write the first draft of a plain language summary? Like, did you have any experience writing this kind of document before?
Yeah, so regarding my experience, I've been working at Dana Farber as a science writer in the Breast Oncology Center for about 2 years, when I first learned that we would be producing these plain language summaries. And in that time, I built up some pretty good experience writing technical documents like manuscripts, grant applications, clinical trial protocols. And fortunately for me, I also had been doing freelance science writing since grad school, in which I developed educational materials for advanced high school students and college students. And these were kind of news style articles based on published scientific peer reviewed journal articles. So I did have some experience writing scientific content for a less medically inclined audience, but I hadn't written anything like a plain language summary before. Now that was new to me. So fortunately, the breast oncology leadership had contracted a third-party medical communications agency. And so I was kind of coached by a professional medical writer who had experience writing plain language summaries. And they walked me through the process in creating this document and what the final published document should look like. And that experience was very helpful for me. It provided a very good baseline on how to go about this. And yeah, our team has since developed our own process for writing a plain language summary and our own criteria for what the final document should look like. But it was made a lot easier by that initial coaching. So I'm very appreciative of that.
And then, so even with a bit of coaching, though, I'm sure it was a learning curve to go from super technical into what we call plain language, sort of understandable language. So how long did it take you to write that first draft? And, you know, um, do you use other materials besides the published manuscript to write the PLS?
Yeah, so I think when I was on my own, as it were, I think the first one took about 8 hours to write. And since then, since I've written quite a few more, it ranges generally from about 4 to 12 hours for me to create a PLS. And that's from the first draft to the final published one that's signed off by the PI. And the reason for that range is because on the short end of the spectrum, it's important to note that for a lot of these plain language summaries, I actually worked with the PI to draft the manuscript. So I'm pretty familiar with the trial, the background, the design, and the outcomes and all that. So in those cases, it generally doesn't take me as long to write the PLS. There have been a couple where writing the PLS is my introduction to the trial or the study. I hadn't even heard about it beforehand. And so in those cases, I do need to read the manuscript and all the background materials and familiarize myself with the trial. And those are the ones that take a bit longer. And yes, so in addition to the manuscript, I also use the clinical trial protocol and the informed consent document when I'm writing the PLS.
So has it gotten easier over time?
Hmm.
Oh, drink that water. Yes.
Yeah, no, it definitely has. And the primary challenge for me wasn't so much in learning how to write simply. That was, just kind of a technical process, learning to use short sentences, simple words. So the style of writing wasn't the challenge so much as keeping the intended audience in mind. Again, I've been writing highly technical documents for a medical audience for 2 years, and I had had that previous experience writing slightly less technical documents to a still rather scientifically literate audience for years. And so keeping the intended lay audience in mind was the primary challenge, trying to remember what to include and what not to include. And I found it pretty challenging to just distill, these clinical trial results, include all the relevant background, explain these medical concepts while still keeping the document concise and understandable. And yeah, so that part has gotten easier over time, but that was the primary learning curve for me, at least in this whole process.
And I imagine there's also a certain amount of, I guess, diplomacy that's involved because there can be conflicting perspectives on what to share, how to share. And I see even there's some questions coming in about like what results do you choose to report and how do you do it? And if people disagree on how things are, what's being reported or how it's being reported, there may be some conflict. How have you balanced conflicting perspectives in this regard?
And yeah, so when conflict arises, again, it depends on the source of the conflict, but in most cases, it's our communication that really helps us get through it. So, for instance, most of the plain language summaries are reviewed by two or more patient advocates, and there may be disagreement between one of the advocates and the rest about how certain information should be presented or what should be included, and we resolve that when we meet together. So
Mhm.
we'll all discuss sort of our edits, our suggested modifications to the plain language summary. And in general, after that discussion, everyone will kind of reach a level of agreement and we'll find a path forward that everyone is happy with. And there have been cases where I've disagreed with the patient advocates, either again about how some information should be presented or if something should be included or not. And we'll meet and we'll discuss it. And after talking about it back and forth, we'll again reach a point where we're happy, where we decide this is the best way to convey the information. It's the most accurate and pertinent to patients and their families, and we'll move forward there. The PI also has to sign off on every one of the plain language summaries, and that's where it's a bit different. Generally, we don't run into conflict with the PI that much because by the time we send it to them, the patient advocates and I have been working on this plain language summary for a while. We're very happy with it, and the PI is usually pretty happy with it at that point. They might have a couple of minor suggestions, maybe grammatical, maybe nothing. Of course, if they point out anything they feel is an inaccuracy, we'll correct it. If there's something they feel should be included that for some reason we haven't included, we'll add it because ultimately the PI designed and led the study. They published the manuscript, so they're responsible for all published content related to the trial. And so they have
Mhm.
the final sign off on the plain language summary too. And deciding what to include, we use the manuscript as our guide. Like for a clinical trial, we'll report the primary outcome. We'll
Mhm.
report secondary outcomes, usually if they're complementary to the primary outcome. So if the primary outcome is progression-free survival, for instance, then we'll report overall survival. Or if it's objective response rates, then we might do progression-free survival if that's a secondary endpoint. And again, we discussed that with the advocates too, because it has to be accurate, the same narrative as the paper, and also include all information that would be pertinent to patients, members of the public, so they can understand why the trial was done and what the results are, what it showed.
And I think that speaks to also just having then a bit of a framework so that a priori you have a sense of what is going to be reported. So there isn't also cherry picking of results and those kinds of pieces. And I think that I'm sure our other panelists could comment on that as well. And we'll come back to that question about the which endpoints and which results to report on. Because I think I want to ask you one last thing, Tim, and that's really around there, even when there has been conflict or you have disagreed with the patient advocates potentially, the patient perspective, no doubt, has helped in creating the PLS. And so I would love to hear just a little bit about how that has shaped your learning and experience with creating PLS.
Oh yeah, no, the patient advocate perspective has been invaluable because my background as a researcher, even when writing these, I always run the risk of writing them from the perspective of a researcher, and that can introduce unintentional bias just in how I present information and accidentally make it too technical. And so having Paula and Christine and the other advocates work with me, they can really help keep me on track for making sure that we create a document that's geared toward the intended audience. And just overall, I think that that's helped tremendously in this process with me learning. Even from the beginning, now I'm a lot better at writing them, keeping the audience in mind and how we need to present this information. So yeah, it's just been invaluable.
It's fabulous. It's such a fabulous story of like, you can do it. Might be this scientific, technical person, and you can do it. You can make information understandable. And in fact, is a testament to that, even understanding the information even better because you've been able to simplify it so others can understand it. Um, well, I really appreciate you sharing your experience with us today, Tim. And I'm going to pass a question on to Christine and Paula to answer because I see it coming up in the Q&A as well about what makes a good plain language reviewer, a good PLS reviewer, a good lay reviewer, and where can you find them? So maybe let us in on your secrets. Christine, you take it away. Paula, you want to pass it on to Christine? All right,
Yes.
awesome.
So first of all, I am a volunteer at Dana Farber, and we have actually a large group of volunteers whom Paula is able to call on to participate with Tim as part of this team. And once again, it started several years ago with very excellent input from someone who I think is actually on the call. And we have modified the process in a way that works for us, particularly around the issues of scheduling meetings. We do a lot more by email, providing comments, and a lot less with 10 people on the call. But who makes a good lay reviewer? So from our perspective, dealing with oncology trials, we think the type of person for us who makes a good reviewer depends on the complexity of your underlying research. Oncology, cancer, is complicated. It's very confusing to patients. The disease is complex. The treatments are complex. The trials are complex, and patients really have a hard time understanding it. So for us, we found that the best reviewers to provide input to Tim are our patient advocates who are willing to read the underlying research paper, who can help focus on the content to make sure that what Tim is distilling from it makes sense from a patient perspective. He doesn't use words like primary endpoint, secondary endpoint. It's embedded in the writing, but all that sort of clinical trial talk, wording is not in the PLSs. And so we care about wording, but he's pretty much, we're past that. I mean, the words are simple. At first it was harder, words like median. What word do you use? He doesn't define median, it's midpoint, right, Tim? I think that's what we work on. So that was, we struggled through that at first, but at this point, it's really about the content, and which is why we have to read the underlying paper to even understand what the content is. And to play this role as a reviewer means that the reviewers have to be curious. They have to ask questions of themselves, understand what's in that paper. We talk amongst ourselves as patient advocates to understand it, and to state opinions while remaining open to other perspectives. You just can't stand firm. Early on in the process, we decided that Tim was the decider. So it's he works on consensus, but it usually properly reflects a lot of input. But we always try to put ourselves, and we are all patients, put ourselves in the shoes of fellow patients who don't understand very much about science or cancer. In non-cancer trials, or ones that are more straightforward, I think you could have lay reviewers with less subject matter expertise. I think that would be okay. But for anyone who is doing that, I would still suggest that you ask your reviewers to comment on the content, not just wording, not just being wordsmiths of a PLS document. Ask them for ideas about how to communicate findings in graphics that are meaningful, not glitzy. Not glitzy, that really communicate the results. And if they can read the underlying papers or other materials, it's even better. Tim is very organized. He distributes all the paper, the protocol, distributes that material to us, and we have access to it. How do you find these reviewers? Our task is easier for the fact that we have this large patient research advocate group, all of whom are patients that can be drawn on. And as we worked through the process of how we work together, what should be in it, we relied on a pretty small core group, but other people are being trained. Other people are being trained. We're not going back and reinventing the wheel. They're being trained on what's been developed. Most academic medical centers don't have a resource like this, advocates group. But I would point out what you all have is patients. You have patients whom you can ask to be reviewers. That's where all our advocates come from. We're all patients. Oncologists make referral to us. The best ones are people who ask a lot of questions. They may be reading papers, they have interest in research. That means they'll be willing to dig into it. There are also external advocacy groups, oftentimes disease specific, that could be contacted to play a role. And a really great resource is high school science teachers. Remember, we're aiming at a 6th to 8th grade knowledge and reading level. That is exactly the age group they focus on. And another really key resource is actual 7th or 8th graders who, Paula's nephew, for instance, he doesn't play a role in every one of them, because they oftentimes have very refreshing perspectives. I just wanted to say just a lot of the questions that are coming in are all great. So I think it's fantastic, all of you. We're very practical people. We're doers. And frankly, MRCT, they're all doers too. So we are happy to have partnered with MRCT in kind of being your guinea pig in moving this process forward.
Well, the best kind of partners. We're all very like-minded. And so there are so many questions here. And I know we had some prepared questions that we thought through and lots. And so I'm going to just launch in because I think I'm going to go to the question to you again, Tim, just about the endpoints and just making clear if you have any sort of guidance that you can give folks on what to report, right, in the plain language summary. You started saying that, but maybe you can just answer Sean's question around the primary, secondary, exploratory endpoints. Is it study specific? Just so that folks have a sense of what the scope really is.
Yeah, that makes sense. So when we're writing it based on usually a therapeutic trial, we always report the primary endpoint, of course, and usually most of the secondary endpoints. We report the side effects, which are not an endpoint, but very important. And for exploratory endpoints, usually in our plain language summaries, those end up in the section, how has this trial helped? Because again, they are exploratory, so they're usually not directly impacting patient care. Rather, they're moving the research forward. And so that's the section of our plain language summary where we talk about this, especially if it's genomic studies. Those can be very complicated to explain. And we'll usually just say that these studies were conducted, the researchers used that information in this way to sort of move the research forward. But yeah, our general framework is, again, just to follow the published manuscript, because the PLS reflects the published manuscript. So we'll report the endpoints that were in there just in a more understandable way for people to, so that the intended audience can understand them.
Well, and I think, so talking about the published manuscript, there's definitely a bunch of questions about, what if there isn't a published manuscript? Do you return those results? Do you wait until something is published to return those results? Because of course those results are embargoed before. So maybe just quickly touching on those. And then I'd like to get into some of the IRB questions if possible, because I know there's a bunch of IRB related questions.
So far, we have only created plain language summaries for published manuscripts. And part of the reason for that is just that we have a much more established pipeline for publishing manuscripts than for publishing plain language summaries. We've been catching up, frankly. And I think it is going to be that way for the foreseeable future. We're still working on a backlog of published manuscripts. We want to get those results out there in plain language summary form. And we will probably reach a point where we can release plain language summaries in conjunction with the published manuscripts. I'm not sure if that'll be in the Dana Farber website or elsewhere, but they can be released around the same time. I can't see the plain language summaries jumping ahead of the published manuscripts. We always write the manuscripts first, but yeah, someday they might be released in conjunction.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Well, thank you. And so I think, Christine, so you have a lot of experience from the IRB perspective. So, and I think, and I think folks from the audience were also putting this towards Paula too, but I think Christine, you're willing to take some of these IRB questions, right? In terms of, does the IRB review these PLS before sharing them externally and on the website?
Do you want me to answer that one? I would say our very first PLS, I remember because we were just moving forward, was an attempt to create one that would be published simultaneously with the publication of the paper, which was also going to be an important presentation at ASCO. So it was embargoed and whatever. The IRB, it was our first one. It was submitted to them with the paper itself as well as a description of the process, because the underlying informed consent at that time did not contemplate the creation or release of PLSs. So we had to go to the IRB to get that cleared up. They reviewed that PLS because it was part of the package, but subsequently they have become sufficiently comfortable with our process, the quality control, the sign off by the PI, and the fact that those trials are closed. There's no issue of communicating with trial participants while the trial is open. They no longer review the underlying PLSs. We have now also embedded in all the breast trial, the informed consents, language about the possibility of the release of PLSs without getting too mired in the detail of how we would be in touch with them. And I would also say that first PLS was a very sensitive one. So there was enormous amount of attention created around the letter, and it did get released to the participants, I might add. It got released with their ability to call and discuss the results with someone. And so that was a very important learning experience. And it came about with me hopping off a Zoom call and talking to Tim privately on my phone saying, Tim, can we do a PLS in the next week or so? And we actually did. It was great.
It's wonderful, and it's so appreciative of sort of the process you've gone through. Now, if we can go back just one more slide, because I know we're 2 minutes out, so we didn't get to all the questions, but what I want to be clear on is that we'll answer as many of them as we can in writing, and they'll be available with the recording and the slides in the future, so no worries if we couldn't get to them. So please, we'll make sure we get to those for you in the future. And it's just been so wonderful to have all these perspectives shared. And so before we wrap up, Paul, I did want to give you a chance to just sort of maybe some final thoughts on just like getting started. I think, you had some thoughts you shared on like what your advice is for someone who might lack the resources to create the PLS. And if you can quickly sum that up in like a minute.
I think, and Christine said this, and I said this in the presentation, which is you should just get started. Just try. Take a published manuscript, whoever you are, whether you're a PI or some other person within the trial research area, and just try to do it. And you could follow, there's many models you can follow. You can follow ours if you want, and just take and think about who is your audience. That's I think the most important thing in this whole thing, Sylvia, is depending on how your audience is, then you have to gear it to that audience and know what you want to do. What are your goals? And then just try and do it. And then have people who your audience intended on have them read it. But you don't know until you try. And the most important thing, though, is that as a patient, this really matters to us, right? We want to be able to understand how this trial has helped. And as a patient and as trial participants, it's really important. So that's my end.
I love that. And that is what we're doing this for. So thank you so much for that. And on the next couple of slides, I just have a few additional resources to point folks to. If you're writing plain language summaries and you want some easy to understand definitions of some terminology, we have our clinical research glossary from the MRCT Center. And aggregate results aren't the only results and data that patients want back when they're in a study. There's individual return of results and data as well. And the MRCT Center has been doing work in this space. So please look at that as well if you want to start thinking about how to really make clinical trial data helpful to participants moving forward. And on the next slide, I'll just also highlight just that there's one more webinar in the series coming up on Tuesday, looking at designing PowerPoints that are accessible and easy to follow. So, because we're doing so much more in the virtual space. So, well, that'll be led by the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion team of the MRCT Center next week. And then on the next slide, just wanted to highlight again, we've been around for 15 years and we have our annual symposium in November featuring some really wonderful talks and panels and considerations of where we've been and where we're going in the future. And we have Carol Al-Fazad coming, presenting from FDA as our keynote, and just a really wonderful sense of the community that's built around clinical trials and sort of globally to make clinical trials work better. So thank you again to everybody for coming today. Thank you to this wonderful group of folks. We had at its peak like 125 folks or so, which is fantastic. And thank you, Paula and Christine and Tim, for taking the time out of your busy schedules to share what you've learned in this process for the benefit of others, so that hopefully we can all be doing what we need to be doing with sharing this information with patients, participants, and their caregivers and families. Thank you so much.
Thank you.